everyone. My name is Michael Goff, and I'm Principal Product Marketing here at Revenera, and I'd like to welcome you to today's roundtable discussion, Converting Your Global Software Piracy and License Compliance Pipeline. I'm excited to have Revenera's VP of Product Management for Software Monetization, Vic DeMarines, with us today. He brings years of experience and expertise, so I'm really looking forward to digging into some of these topics with him. We're also going to be hearing from some legal experts about pursuing compliance in regions that are often perceived to be challenging. We have Jolanta Kamenskaite, who's managing partner at IP Novus Law in Russia, and Shantanu Sahai, partner at Anand & Anand in India. But before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to go through some housekeeping details. First off, the boxes on your screen are movable and resizable. Feel free to maximize the slide area and customize the viewing environment to your liking. Second, today's discussion will be about 45 minutes long. If you have questions or comments along the way, please feel free to add them in the Q&A box on your screen, and we may address them as we go or at the end if time allows. Some networks can cause slides to advance more slowly than others, so logging off your VPN is recommended. If your slides are lagging behind, just push F5 on your keyboard, and that will refresh the page for you. You can also find additional answers to some common technical issues in the Help Engagement tool at the bottom of your screen. That's the one with the question mark sign. And finally, a copy of the recording will be available in the next 48 hours. And do be sure to check out some of the items we've provided in the resource area. So let's get started. Victor, welcome.
Hey, hi, Michael. Glad to be here.
Very glad to have you here. So one of the reasons we're here today is to dig into a topic you wrote about for our blog this summer, and you made a fairly bold prediction. You said, in less than 10 years, we won't be talking about enterprise software piracy anymore. Certain regions will continue to see piracy, but I predict that a downward trend in piracy globally will only accelerate. So can you talk a little bit about this, and sort of what led you to start that conversation, what reactions you've been getting from the compliance community, things like that?
Yeah, sure. I think certainly one of the triggers for that is my recent involvement in working with at Revenera with a lot of software publishers who are, linking in their SaaS applications. They're moving from subscription or perpetual to subscription and even consumption-based licensing. They're introducing new elastic licensing methods to help with the temporary use of software or evaluation, or to allow project use of what was traditionally very hard to acquire software or enterprise software. And it's kind of intuitive as more of this flexibility and more SaaS-based applications become available to end users, that we're going to have a much more connected environment with software publishers, and that's going to reduce piracy. It's also going to help where business models may not have been aligned, or the monetization models may not have been aligned, and that was driving piracy as well. So I think, the good news is we should see piracy, reduced because of those reasons. It doesn't go away. There are a lot of software companies that are still primarily on-premise. They have air gap situations. They have clients that are using their technology that may be even 5 years old, so it's hard for newer applications to penetrate that base. But I think it's pretty clear where the trend's going.
Great. And so somewhat surprisingly, when we look at this slide, we see some research that we did. We have our annual monetization monitor. We do a survey of software suppliers. And when it comes to revenue leakage from unlicensed use, it's interesting that suppliers still don't know how much revenue they're losing to piracy, overuse, and misuse by fairly significant percentages. Do those numbers surprise you at all?
No, I don't think that surprises me per se. I think, again, if you haven't been looking at this, or you've been focusing on some of those new SaaS initiatives, it might be a surprise in terms of how much of the revenue you've been losing. I think if you have been in the market for quite a while, if you think about some of the larger brands out there, you had grown up with the piracy problem. You probably evolved your strategies. But I still encounter companies that really haven't targeted or had assumed piracy is really just a viral marketing type issue. And there's an opportunity for them, and they also need to certainly learn about what that leakage might be.
That's a great point. And speaking of opportunity and being reactive versus proactive, it does seem like, from the results that we got from this survey we did and reported on just recently in our monetization monitor for software compliance and piracy, most respondents are still sort of learning about revenue leakage from these more reactive sources, anecdotal reports from sales and support, whistleblower reports, an audit program, and far fewer, 19%, are getting that intelligence from telemetry or phone home data, which I think is interesting. Stop moving the slides, Vic.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to check that it was being shared, Michael.
It is being shared. So let's see. So, but that brings up a good point, right? So even though 19% of folks are using telemetry for compliance, what we do see from the same survey is that right now 70% of suppliers, of respondents, are collecting product usage data for a wider range of reasons, right? And we expect to see that grow up to 79% by 2023. What are you seeing? Because I know that obviously you look at product usage data both for compliance, but also in some other regions. What are some of the drivers that you're seeing pushing that forward? Creating that gap.
I think there's a lot of companies under pressure to take advantage of the cloud and SaaS-based applications. To do that, you have to understand how the end customers are using your products. And if you've been traditionally a channel type company or a company where you don't have some of that direct feedback within your application, there's a lot of interest in telemetry or being able to capture actual usage data with the products to have informed decisions that help drive your strategy. And we certainly have seen that interest across the board in Revenera, even with our more traditional entitlement management solutions, where our customers are driving us to build, better methods to share that data with their own internal BI. So usage data, product adoption data has become even more important now to support strategies. Yeah,
and interesting, but maybe not so surprising that 9% have no plans to collect product usage data at all. Probably thinking more along, data privacy issues or maybe contractual limitations with their customers.
Yeah, or maybe they're having issues with really resources. Are the resources there? Are the resources focused on other initiatives, again, cloud or SaaS? And is it more difficult for them to instrument an application that maybe didn't have these collection methods in that application and introduce or penetrate their market to get advantage of that? I think the privacy and the legal aspects are well covered now. I think software companies that are collecting data purely from a usage perspective or even a compliance perspective know how to disclose the purpose of what they're doing, and they certainly have legitimate needs. So I think there's already a pretty well-established method, process to introduce the technology into their applications. So I don't specifically think that is the challenge.
Yeah. And sort of one other interesting thing from these findings is, right now, only 26% think that they're doing this really well. And then 44% are needing to invest sort of manual work or engineering time in order to make sense of the data. So it really speaks to the value that a packaged solution of analytics around product usage can really help you get more out of that data without having to rely on those external resources like you were talking about. And then I think one of the benefits of having this product usage data is the ability, certainly from a compliance perspective, to pull together a list like this. So this is our top 20 list of software license misuse and piracy hotspots as of February 2022. It's aggregate customer data, customers using Revenera compliance intelligence. And, it shows big picture-wise where we're seeing a lot of these hotspots. What do you see when you look at this list? I mean, obviously we see China at the very top of the list, not too surprising. What else are you seeing on this list that might be of interest to the folks listening today?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most interesting thing, and you can see these large red areas where you expect in China and Russia, but to see U.S. at the top, India, Germany, Brazil, even in terms of, and even France and Italy. Some more mature markets where compliance is, there are mechanisms certainly to go after opportunity in those regions. That's always a surprise to someone who's looking at this at the first time. But it does make sense when you look at what are the most mature markets, what are the largest markets and consumers of software. You would expect that ratio, and there is a high degree of difference between the data that we see from China and everywhere else, and that speaks to some of the issues we have there with intellectual property. But certainly, the compliance programs that I've been supporting with our customers, it's usually global programs, and there's a lot to be sort of responded to even in countries like U.S. and Germany and others.
Yeah, for sure. And of course, the nice thing about this data is it's actionable, right? So it's letting software suppliers identify who's actually behind it. Now, obviously, their heat map is going to look very different from this aggregate data one, but it's almost a roadmap for where they should prioritize their efforts.
Right.
And speaking of which, maybe you can talk a little bit about this, calculator that you work with, customers on to sort of see where they're seeing piracy, and then talk about how you map out, what sort of their ROI could look like.
Yeah, and I think this is an interesting opportunity to those companies that are starting to pursue, a compliance program, because there's certainly a lot of experience now in terms of enforceability rates for different regions. And so what you're seeing here, and it's not expected to read this, but what you're seeing here is a spreadsheet that allows you to essentially build what the return on investment would be if you were to start a compliance program. So you know what your average sales price of your products are. You know, or should know, the distribution within the different regions, Americas, Asia, et cetera. And because we know what the piracy rates are through multiple sources, our own data, as well as some of the BSA and IDC estimates from the past, overlaying that with enforceability, you can predict what you get as a return on investment. And it all doesn't happen in the initial go in terms of when you deploy this type of solution. It does take years to build up. Basically, 3 years is what we recommend when doing this calculation. But it does offer you a way to say, is this something that we should undertake? What is the revenue that we can expect? What is that return on investment? Yeah,
great point. And I know we've touched upon compliance intelligence, but before we jump into a case study where we talk about it, can you just talk briefly about what compliance intelligence is and how it works and what it does?
Yeah, and I think this is general in nature. I mean, Revenera has its own compliance intelligence solution, but think of it as a usage intelligence capability, but its focus is on gathering evidence and building a profile that helps you match the usage data to an account. And for most of our customers, there are, prospects and customers who are inactive customers, but mostly we find that 50% of the data that's generated by these programs are existing customers that might be overusing. And then you have prospects, and those prospects may or may not be in your CRM and your database. So by, having, one of the first things that compliance intelligence delivers is being able to build actionable data, data that gives you enough evidence so that you can reach out to those organizations and start that conversation on making them either, if they're a customer, making them a genuine customer, or if they're a prospect, bringing them into the fold with the right products. And it also, the second point here is it helps quantify, right? So you could have had a lot of discussion leading up into this about what are the myths in terms of how much piracy is happening with our product. But with this type of telemetry or this type of solution, you're going to know. You're going to know, is it in your backyard? How much of a problem it is? If you are more in a niche market with your products, it may not be a big problem. But again, this would prove that, and it would answer that question and help balance your investment in anti-piracy and compliance programs moving forward. And then the last point, it is tracking your intellectual property, and that's really important. If you had a pretty unique application and you have partners in the market, we have seen that situation where they are, through pirated software, gaining access to the latest technology. You want to track that. So that is also a benefit of technology like this.
Thanks, Vic. I think that provides good context, because the next thing I'd like us to talk about is the fact that we're using compliance intelligence in-house on one of our own products. Can you tell us more about that story?
Yeah, so when we were first, Revilytics is where our compliance intelligence solution originated, and Revenera acquired us about 2 years ago. One of the first things that we identified was, hey, in the portfolio of Revenera's products, there is a product that has some level of piracy activity. That's one of the first things that we look for when we look to adopt or position to a new client. And we also had a need to enable Revenera. So people who are, the internal employees, the people that want to learn about the solution, it's hard to do that with existing customers because it's their data. We can't necessarily gain access to their data. So having, a product within our portfolio that we can use the solution with, and then also demonstrate sort of the value was really key to us. So we rolled out an integration to InstallShield. InstallShield is a very steady revenue producing product for us. I think it has over 30,000 active licenses out there, so it had the right profile. It's been out in the market for quite a while. And the team actually really adopted the strategy because they had been fighting some of the piracy they've seen out in the different dark websites and different ways of trying to do that with licensing. So they really adopted this strategy of, okay, let's go gather intelligence, look at the kind of data, and see if this is a revenue generating program. And the good news is about a year and a half in, we're now generating about 9% of additional revenue on top of their license revenue, which is a great place to be for most mature compliance programs. And when we looked at the regional distribution of this data, it started, in the EU and US, but has now expanded even to Spain, Korea, and Russia. And this metric here, it's, again, a little hard to read, but I think the surprising thing was within this first release that we integrated this technology in, very shortly did we realize that 50% of the data was coming from piracy and 50% from licensed use of the application. And that's a pretty high number. Right? Most predictions are you're in the 30% range from a license leakage. And actually in that license data, it was pretty clear early on that we had overuse. And that became another opportunity for revenue generation.
Yeah, that's a great point. And obviously, this graph shows some of that difference between overuse and piracy. Do you want to talk more about that?
Yeah. Just and when we look at the bar chart and you see blue is piracy, what this is talking about are the accounts that are being created. And one of the, when you look at piracy, you're looking at, especially for this type of product, 1 or 2 licenses or 1 or 2 users in an organization using this pirated version of InstallShield. But what became more interesting for the compliance team is starting to understand the overuse situation that was happening, because those are bigger deals. You have multiple seats. And like any other software application, if it was bound to a user and the company was acquired or they're partnering with another firm, they were seeing the sprawl of their software within that organization. And we've actually integrated the compliance intelligence with the entitlement management solution, so we can see that in a faster way. So yes, piracy is an interesting revenue opportunity, but overuse has overtaken it from pure dollars perspective. And that's what that's showing, is the focus on the accounts in that area. And then from a regional perspective, where are accounts, these compliance accounts being created from a territory perspective. And it's certainly global, but you can see the top ones are not surprising there.
Yep, and definitely speaks to taking a layered approach to your monetization, right? Certainly within compliance, there are lots of different events that can be monetized.
That's right.
So we've been talking at a high level, done a case study, talked about the data, but I thought now might be an interesting time to jump to my conversation that I had last week with Jolanta Kaminskaite. Again, she's managing partner at IP Novus Law in Moscow, Russia. Let's hear what she had to say. Welcome, Jolanta Kaminskaite. You're managing partner at IP Novus Law in Moscow, Russia, where your legal practice includes copyright and trademark enforcement and related litigation. I know you coordinate a team of lawyers who work on civil and criminal IP enforcement actions in Russia, the CIS, and Lithuania. So I'm really glad that you could join us today.
Thank you, Michael. I'm glad to be here and ready to answer all the questions you may have in that respect.
Fantastic. So I know some software suppliers are nervous to pursue cases in Russia. Can you tell us a little bit about what's been working in Russia that would make them more confident about pursuing license compliance and piracy cases there?
Yes, indeed. Our law firm works with international software suppliers, and usually this is the question that is being raised in front of us. So what can I say that as of today, situation is stable, meaning that Russia has quite advanced laws comparing to other countries. And in general, I would say that Russia and CIS countries, they are very similar and to the all EE countries, meaning that all the intellectual property laws and the practices developed in the same way. So basically, it's already 17 years ago when we started with pioneer cases. So as of today, police, they do a lot of ex officio cases, maybe a little bit less because the software suppliers has chosen another way for the license compliance, and we call it a soft way. So when there is no criminal litigation or something, so they follow the way of the software letter approach programs.
So talk a little bit more about what that process looks like and how successful those are on average.
So I would say that during the last 5 years, we've been focusing pretty much on this softer approach of license compliance matters. And to start, I will try to describe the ideal case scenario that could lead to the result, meaning that, as we call, legalization, and reaches the aim of compliance for the potential users. So basically what we require is the ideal lead. We call it as a quality lead, which is very important on our end. And that is usually the data which is based on right holders telemetrics. And first of all, we require the IP address and static IP address, because dynamic IP addresses lead to different information, which is very difficult further to confirm. Another thing which is very important is the domain name of the legal entity, which is potentially behind that. Also, it's important to have the program versions of the supplier, as well as account, cast, and host name and account name is also important too. We know how to work with this information in order not to breach the confidential, the personal data clauses. However, this all data is kind of plays an important role when we approach the targets and when they know that we have this information and kind of they treat it as an evidence. So first of all, we also based on this information, it's easier for us to identify the legal entity which is behind that, because in Russia, it's as in many Eastern European countries, nobody really goes after the physical person. So it's important to identify the legal entity. And in usual cases, we start with the soft approach, meaning that we send the companies the C&D letter, and we also make the follow-up calls. However, I would say that this approach leads to maybe 25-30% of companies who react and legalize, and sometimes even they do it silently, not responding to our letters. However, they go silently and buy, but we call it as an ideal case scenario as well. But in order to increase the chances of successful, I would say, approach, we also use and we approach the enforcement agencies. Usually it's being perceived by our clients that approaching enforcement agency means immediate initiation of the criminal matter or some maybe administrative matter. However, what we notice that through this approach, there is a first stage is investigation, which means that police or prosecutors that we also approach in Russia, they are entitled to contact the company and request the potential defendant, to provide evidence that they have licenses. And in our view, this is also an ideal case scenario, because then the company understands the high risk, and without even us contacting them. So this also situation leads to the higher number of legalizations, to the compliance matters. And if the company, again, it doesn't lead to any kind of, it doesn't reach our aim, we can still ask police to raid the company at the end of the day. And even if they don't do that, we have the way to follow the civil route, and using the evidence that were collected by police and also the telemetric data, even though this route will be a little bit longer and maybe a little bit more expensive because of the litigation. However, all the possibilities are here, and probably the international right holders just need the courage and business orientation to increase the numbers in legalization.
That's great. Thanks, Jolanta. Really glad you could join us today and share just how effective both that softer approach of sending letters is, all the way through the criminal enforcement and the civil enforcement actions too. It's good to know that software suppliers can enforce their rights in Eastern Europe and Russia. So thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. You're welcome.
So Vic, really interesting there. Hearing that, it's certainly possible to achieve success in compliance in Russia. Also, interesting to hear that, that soft approach, works there too. It's one that works very well in North America, Western Europe, starting with a letter campaign. But the fact that they can use that in Russia, I think might be surprising to some. But also very interesting, not surprising to hear that, the quality of the leads are important too. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's, when you start to expand your program into a region like Russia, and obviously using partners to do it, the level of evidence or the threshold goes up. And we spend a lot of time working with our customers to make sure they have confidence that this is that, or, the data is leading to that particular organization. And it's certainly a partner like within Russia would have that same eye on it and would want to vet that information. So it's not just about data collection, it's the evidence and how strong a match it is to the organization. It's really important.
Yeah. And another point she made that, some folks may have missed is, it is important to make sure that, you have existing or ongoing infringement. Timing matters, right? They're getting this actionable data, but it's important not to sit on it. So, okay, so that's Russia. So I also spoke with Shantanu Sahay, who's partner at Anand & Anand in India. So let's hear about compliance programs there and what folks are doing in that region. Welcome, Shantanu Sahay. You're a partner at Anand & Anand in Noida, India, where you are in charge of its IT and e-commerce law practice group, working for various clients, including Microsoft, Business Software Alliance, and Siemens. You manage anti-piracy campaigns in India, which include letter campaigns, initiating civil lawsuits in courts on behalf of clients, as well as carrying out criminal enforcement tasks across India. Welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for having me here. Pleasure talking to you.
Likewise. And over the last decade, letter campaigns have really been the most common and effective way of pursuing compliance. But you've told me that COVID has had an impact on these campaigns. Can you talk a little bit how you've pivoted to deal with that?
Right. Thanks for the question, Michael. In fact, if I may go a couple of years before the COVID struck, even during those times, the letter campaign was having some sort of a downward trend in terms of conversions. And we were only looking at a percentage wise of 25 to 30 of these in terms of success, unfortunately. And then came COVID in early 2020, which basically put almost a death knell in this campaign. And the most important factor would be the economic impact and the conventional perception as to not to spend too much on the IT infrastructures, which basically gave a lot of leeway to the infringers not to respond to the legal notices, or even if they respond, they would have their standard explanation as to what are the reasons why they don't want to procure softwares. So consequently, we figure that the campaign as such has taken a hit, and there was a tremendous need to try and reinvent the enforcement and the compliance wheel, and that is where we sort of strategize and got back to some sort of an alternative mechanism to deal with such infringements in India.
And what are those alternatives?
Yeah, so we already had a pre-existing campaign which was called the pre-litigation mediation campaign, which we used to run in Delhi High Court, which had given us a success in terms of 45 to 50%. But the most important thing which we started was to file civil lawsuits, uh, primarily in the Delhi High Court. And the evidence which we took in those cases were the phone home data which is collected by these technologies. And fortunately for us, after a couple of days of hearing, we saw that the courts were more than eager to grant us injunctions. And then once we have that injunction with us, that gave us a lot of leeway and power to negotiate with the other side. And as a result, we could see good successes happening, and that too in record time. And in almost for 18 to 19 months, we filed about 60 lawsuits itself, and it's turning out to be a great campaign in India in respect of civil enforcement. Yeah.
And then you've also mentioned, the criminal enforcements, and how do those work?
And not particularly, Michael, because normally the software publishers do not want to have a potential customer on the other side of the table or practically behind bars. So in India, and from a strict compliance enforcement perspective, we do not advise our clients to go in for criminal enforcement. Rather, what we suggest them, in case they do not want to file lawsuits or even send out legal notices, we want to engage the infringers in a pre-litigation mediation format, as what we discussed, a couple of minutes ago. And it's an effective mechanism, no doubt, and it has a good success rate as well.
And that makes sense too, right? You want these infringers to become, good customers long term.
Exactly.
So the more you can do to make that work out, the better. So for companies that are, just getting started with compliance, or even for more, mature programs, what are some of the things that you suggest that they consider when it comes to building a more holistic license compliance program in India?
So, Michael, we have gone past that phase of education, at least in India, if you look at South Asia as a region. So, practically, I'm not looking at some sort of huge investment in educational awareness or, trying whole workshops, so on and so forth. Practically, every company understands what are the dynamics behind a software compliance engine. So, in my understanding and with our experience in the months which have gone by post COVID, what we realize is that we need to focus on two aspects. One is there has to be some sort of an easy and a quick escalation, which means that you do not spend too much of time period in terms of negotiations with the other side, even if you sent out the legal notice. I mean, you may only look at max to max 15 days, 20 days, but you need to have some sort of an escalation. It can either be a lawsuit or it can either be a pre litigation mediation. But then the idea is not to send out that message in the market that, look, the software publishers have that patience to wait until the other side, comes back on the negotiation. That's one aspect. Second is, and especially with regards to those companies who would want to have an engine implemented in India, we would advise them to file a couple of lawsuits to start with. The idea is to gain some sort of a legal precedence, and it's very easy now, after having argued all those cases in India, to get injunctions on day one. And we're not even asking the publishers to do an audit. Whatever data we have from the phone home technology, that's enough for me to get injunction and then start the negotiations. So as an advantage, what's going to happen is it's going to set a good ecosystem, a healthy space for these software publishers to have their various campaigns subsequently running in, maybe a legal notice or a pre-litigation mediation, but at least 2 3 good low-hanging civil cases they should file in India to have a good start in this compliance.
That's great. Thank you, Shantanu, for joining us today. Really good to know for us and for our audience that you can achieve license compliance success in India, and that you're obviously achieving it. So thank you again for joining us.
Thanks, Michael. Always pleasure talking to you.
Likewise. Take
You
care.
have a nice day.
So Vic, once again, at least for me, right, very interesting to see that, that soft approach does work in India as well, starting with a letter campaign. Interestingly, and not too surprisingly, Shantanu mentioned that during COVID, there weren't a lot of people who were responding to those letters. So they've started to file, some litigation too, to sort of up the ante a little bit. But definitely interesting that he came out and said, set a precedent, start with, filing some lawsuits. So those letters that you do send in the future have some teeth behind them. And that's an approach we've seen, in other regions too. Yes.
Yep. I think when you have to escalate, you certainly need to choose those carefully. And again, I think it's more that type of program to escalate and even file lawsuits is a more mature program that's already had experience working with what I would call low-hanging fruit. That might be in their backyard in terms of where they're located. And after having a lot of experience with the letter campaign and the follow-up and understanding when and where do you want to escalate. So it makes sense to me.
Yeah, and if we go back to our top 20 list, we talked about Russia in the number 2 spot, talked about India in the number 4 spot. Good to see that compliance is possible, sort of contrary to what a lot of software suppliers might think. So let's look at the number 1 on our list, China, right? So we do see a lot of piracy and overuse and misuse there. This is a report that came from Rouse and Ciela. They're folks that do a lot of work, consulting and legal work in the IP space. Stay tuned. We're going to be hopefully doing something with them specifically to drill into this. But also, again, really interesting, they've analyzed all these published cases of copyright litigation by foreign software licensors in Chinese courts between 2010 and 2019. And their findings were pretty interesting, right? So they saw that win rates are high. And sort of interestingly, but the most prolific filers have had poorer results. And they actually said the win rate for foreign plaintiffs is 85.3%. And they said, well, this is really high. Yeah, it is in fact lower than the win rate for domestic software plaintiffs. But their analysis shows that this average is brought down by 2 of the most prolific plaintiffs in their data set who filed bulk lawsuits and received a markedly lower win rate. But several other plaintiffs who filed far fewer cases enjoyed 100% success rate. So I think it is a matter of doing the right sort of targeting, making sure that you're doing things properly, working, with the right partners. And again, as we see here, and I recommend folks download this report, the compensation awarded by the courts is high compared with other types of IP cases. But interestingly, and again, not surprisingly, evidence of the scale of the infringement is of primary importance. And that does make sense, right? Like, when you have that data, it's in your best interest to make the most of it. And as Yolanta said, to act on it, don't let it get stale. Same thing in China, it sounds like, where you really need to make sure that you're coming armed with good evidence, both to set the tone for your litigation, but also if you're going to try to take a softer approach.
Yeah, I think it's good news just in general for companies to know they can take action in China, because that's when they start a program like this, it's their first belief is all the data's in China. So to know that there's the right way and the process to go after that information and recover revenue in that territory is good news. I think a lot of companies are still scared to do any sort of action in China, worrying about losing a market opportunity there. But I think this is evidence that contradicts that. And I think you can have a successful program in China.
Yeah. And again, when you look at that top 20 list, it's good to know that even the regions you expect to be enforceable, the ones where you don't expect that, just from past experience or myths about compliance, there is good activity happening in those regions. So let's look forward a little bit, Vic, and sort of wrap things up for the day. You talked early on about the importance of a holistic software monetization approach. Do you want to say anything more about that?
Well, I just in my experience, and I think certainly in the early days of compliance intelligence, you saw what I thought were very restrictive licensing models, and that certainly can contribute to overuse and piracy. And so you want to look at the piracy data or your usage data with the lens of, well, how can I make it easier? How can I make it easier for companies to take advantage of the software or components of the software that has the most value, and look at different ways to monetize that, because that does have an impact. And I think in the early days we saw all those restrictive licensing or the difficulty in organization getting software actually lending toward the problem. So that's certainly key.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, license compliance is just one part of your overall monetization strategy. But I think these days it is important, to consider entering those new regions that you might have, set aside for the moment, because you're going to get some, good revenue out of there, but also some good insights.
Right.
And then finally, you want to say anything about, product usage data, and sort of pulling that into your other BI systems?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about compliance intelligence, and its deliverable is defining an actionable account, but underlying that is the question, well, how much software did they use? What features or capability in the applications was the end user using? And that becomes really key from a compliance perspective, but it also can help drive your strategies around products. And I think certainly some of the enterprise software that are in, they have suites, they've acquired other modules and bundled that within their application. It's sometimes really hard to discern what is the top value. And that's where usage intelligence comes in, being able to track the use of those features, understand what the true adoption is, and they can work hand in hand with compliance, but they can also have other constituents in the organization that would see that as really valuable. Marketing, from sales, from a customer experience, in adoption perspective, and then from a product or from an engineering perspective, helping drive roadmap strategies with actual use data.
Yeah, great point. And certainly as metrics like daily active users, monthly active users become more relevant,
right,
you also want to slice that by, compliant versus non-compliant active users, right?
Yes.
So great. Thank you, Vic. And I just wanted
Thanks,
to thank everybody for joining us today, but thank you, Vic, for sharing your expertise and your insights today. It's always great chatting with you and getting your perspective. Even when things don't go technically right, we can roll with it. I also want to thank Jolanta Kaminskaite from IP Novus Law in Russia and Shantanu Sahey, partner at Anand in India, for joining us and sharing their experiences. Thank you for pre-recording those so we wouldn't have to keep you up too late to do this live. And of course, thank you all for joining us today. And please feel free to reach out with any questions or comments you have. We appreciate your joining us. Thanks and have a great day.
Bye-bye.